Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for the latest installment in Humentum's Operationalizing Locally Led Development series. And this topic is going to be on ensuring inclusivity by design. First, we just want to say a quick thank you to our partners, which help ensure that we can run and manage our convenings here at Humentum. And I would like to offer a special thank you to the sponsor of today's webinar, which is MFAN, the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, of which Humentum has recently become a member. MFAN is a bipartisan reform coalition composed of international development and foreign policy practitioners, policy advocates, and experts from the US and the Global South. They promote more accountable and effective US foreign assistance that advances interests, delivering greater results for people in need and US taxpayers. And they are centered around two guiding principles of accountability and locally led development, which makes them a perfect fit to be the sponsor of today's webinar. And we are really excited to be a part of them as Humentum and thank them for their support. With that, I will just go over a couple of housekeeping items before turning it over to our moderator, Eni Chipimbere, our Director for Locally Led Development at Humentum. We've enabled the chat, so please do drop any questions you may have in the chat. And subtitles are available. You can click the closed captioning button below. And the webinar is being recorded, and we will make sure that everybody receives a link within approximately 48 hours. So with that, I am going to stop there and hand it over to my colleague, Eni. Eni, take it away.
Thank you, Jenna. Could you help by muting any of the mics? Okay, thank you, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. Very excited because this is a very important focus for us. And just to reiterate the purpose of the Operationalizing Local Development webinar series. So this series started last year in 2022. And this year is a continuation of the work we were doing. Last year was all about unpacking, what are the operational barriers to locally led development. And then from this, we managed to develop a policy blueprint outlining the steps the global development sector must take. And this year, we are doing a much deeper dive into the how, okay? We are continuing the conversation and honing in on the steps that organizations are already taking or could take to shift power and also to shift their operations, and thus unlocking the strategic value of operations in achieving locally led development. And for this particular webinar, we are going to, and thank you to our panelists who I will introduce very soon, and a wealth of insights and learning and experience. So for this particular webinar, we are looking at the relationship between equitable development that's locally driven and also inclusive, right? And so we'll unpack some of the major guidelines. We will look at commitments around inclusive development and explore what those policies may look like when put into practice, as well as, when you're talking about things like equity, things like inclusion, you cannot assume that everybody in the room understands what that is and how that shows up in development and how best to make sure we consider it in development. So part of the purpose of this webinar is actually to increase all our awareness through the lens of the people who are working at the coalface of inclusivity in equitable development that is locally driven. And the discussion, therefore, will center around the experiences of traditionally marginalized communities, and we'll hear from a variety of global development actors, including representatives from the disability community, LGBTIQ community, youth-led global development actors, as well as hear from the sex workers community. And so I will hasten, because we've got a bit of a large panel, and I want to make sure we give them as much time to engage with us. So I would like to start by introducing the team from Mobility International USA, MIUSA. So you'll hear that acronym a bit. So we've got Susan Sygall, who is co-founder and CEO. And we've got Scader Lewis, based in Malawi, who is their gender, disability, inclusion, and access consultant. So they will share their global, local connection of understanding these issues and some practical experience. And when we start the conversation, they will say a little bit about what their organization does. Then we've got from Outright International, Andrew Park. He is the senior manager for inclusive development at Outright International. And Outright International works together to better LGBTIQ community lives. And Andrew will say a little bit more through what he will share throughout the webinar. And then we've got Willice Onyango sitting in Kenya from the Youth Cafe. He's the executive director. And he will also share what they are doing in terms of equipping other development actors to better work with young people. And then last but not least, we've got Peninah Mwangi, who is also in Kenya, who's the executive director for Hostess Empowerment and a support program that focuses on, it's an organization for and by sex workers, women having sex with women, and women using drugs, and bar hostesses in Kenya. So more on their experiences as well as their guidance to all of us in terms of how to work with that community. So thank you so much to our panelists. We really, really appreciate your being with us. So as a sort of like opening, framing, helping people to understand, starting question, and I'll start with you, Susan and Scader from MIUSA. So equitable development that is locally driven and inclusive is the aspiration. That's what we want to see. That's the ideal. And just for people to understand, why is this framing and relationship important to articulate and advocate for? Just help us understand a little bit better.
Sure. Well, this is Susan. Yeah, thank you so much, Emma, and it's an honor to be on this panel. And for those of you who don't know MIUSA, we advance disability rights and leadership globally. And I'm a proud wheelchair rider, and this really is, for me, is a human rights issue. People with disabilities historically have not been included a lot in international development. And now with the shift going to locally led, it is actually crucial that disabled people take the lead in the locally led movement, which means you've got to give the leadership to local DPOs. You've got to have funding streams that work for smaller DPOs, and that all funding will needs to include reasonable accommodation, which we'll talk more about. And I'm going to pass this on now to Scader.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you, Annie, for the opportunity. I think just to add on what Susan has said, linking inclusive development and framing the relationship for me is very important personally. And in my responses, the other questions, I'll be linking it to my work with MIUSA, but also my own personal experiences as a woman with disability. I think it is important to have this conversation now, and I wish we had it even earlier. One, because it is an approach that is empowering in a way that it is giving power to the local communities to decide and implement programs or development programs that are speaking to their specific needs. it is also an approach that is enhancing resilience. So where you are implementing development in a particular community that is led by the people in that particular community, and by leading, I don't just mean leading in the sense of implementation, but even resourcing and designing the actual programs that they want to implement. It really enhances resilience in a way that people are able to know how to sustain that particular development. But also locally led is development that is contextual in most of the cases, and it responds to the specific needs of a particular context. So the more reason that disabled people themselves in that particular community are involved. And I like the title of our discussion today, that we are inclusivity by design. So yeah, we are being intentional. So if we are inclusive in terms of leadership of disabled people in the development, designing of the development, and the actual implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, then that makes the development more sustainable. It makes it more empowering, and it makes it to be more resilient. So as a way of starting off the discussion, I'll end there and allow other panelists to also just come in and contribute. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, Susan and Scader. You really have framed it so well in terms of some of the things that we should be thinking about. And one thing I really picked on was it's an opportunity. Yes, we may have wanted to start earlier, but it's an opportunity to right traditional sort of like gaps or exclusions or injustices or discriminations. And I would like to hand that over to Andrew to also chime in terms of the framing from the LGBTIQ community. And I'm collecting sort of like key points that I'll bring in at the end of this first segment. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Annie. And yeah, Scader did frame this quite beautifully. So for LGBTIQ people, the aspiration of localization and inclusiveness is important because, of course, this is a population that faces unique development challenges, lower educational attainment, income disparities, health disparities. So it's a population that needs to be responded to in some way. And localization is actually part of inclusivity, because many times the barrier to advancement in terms of programs being inclusive is kind of a lack of knowledge of the local situation. And that lack of knowledge means that kind of assumptions about risk kick in, which we'll get to later in the webinar. And then decision-making is based on, lack of knowledge rather than an assessment of the actual situation. And so localization means talking to LGBTIQ people in country, in the community. And that is the single best way to address these gaps in knowledge that people are facing and all kinds of anxiety that's caused by it. So localization is not just a separate thing from inclusion, it's actually part of inclusion.
Fantastic. And I picked on, you don't talk to people, you don't consult them, you don't include them, risk kicks in, right? Because you default to what you know and what you assume. And there are a lot of assumptions that I know are tagged onto young people, right? For example, so Willice, feel free to jump in and also add a layer to this tapestry we are weaving around, why equitable development that's locally driven has to be inclusive. Over to you, Willice.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to join this discussion today. This Cafe, the organization that I'm the director of, sees itself as a light bulb of youth with respect to African development. To speak about our practical experiences, we are currently the largest convening community of young professionals that are working to harness youth advocacy, policy action for socioeconomic impacts. And this is better seen at the local level. Therefore, I believe that locally led development and that is inclusive are closely intertwined and can be complementary to each other with regards to achieving sustainability and effective development outcomes. Regarding the framework, the framing and the normative setting regarding localization as it relates to young people, I believe that articulating and advocating for equitable development that is youth-led and at local level is of utmost importance for many reasons. It allows for youth voices and needs that are often marginalized from communities to be heard and accounted for. We also see a sense of ownership wherever we co-create with young people, youth organizations. We are membership based, and we have youth organizations within our network. We have young people within our network. And whenever we create programs, this fosters a sense of empowerment and responsibility to take ownership of development outcomes led at the hands of young people. And I think with respect to diversity, cultures, traditions, and practices, which are very local, these are better surfaced if we, democratize development at local level. But specifically, I think that adopting to a gender-responsive approaches, because young people are not homogeneous, population. There are different subsets and subgroups of young people, and then this has to be reflected not only in decision making, but in frameworks that attempt to promote equitability in terms of access to information and opportunity. But most importantly, we see a lot of isms in the whole framing of localization. We have seen, people talk on behalfism. There's this new movement on behalfism where, other organizations speak on behalf of youth organizations. Youth organizations at national levels or at international levels speak on behalf of other young people and youth organizations at subnational levels. I think localization in spirit should give the levers of speech and the ability to articulate people's point of view directly by people, and not have a more mediated framing of addressing issues that are not, the lived experiences and realities of local communities.
I learned something new: behalfism. I better avoid it, right? And and you spoke a lot about the power of voice, and I really liked your last statement that localization in spirit should give the levers of speech to those with the lived experience. I absolutely loved that one. And let's hear from Peninah, as she also takes up the stage and tells us a little bit more about why it's really, really important for equitable development that's locally driven to be inclusive. Over to you, Peninah.
Hi, how are you? Hi, everybody. Is my able on? Yes, very good conversation. When it comes to sex workers and localization, and Hostess being an organization that has been in the space for over 2 decades now, this topic is very important to us. I'll give a few examples. When it comes to partnership, there are various ways of localization and inclusivity. When it comes to the various, even typology of the sexual community, typology of the women, of the feminism movement, a lot calls for inclusivity. But I'll give just practical examples of our experience. I look at ourselves as an organization, and when you see organizations and you look at donors, you see that they are people who are in a position to support, and then we have the bridges who can be used, or who are in a position to accelerate that support to the people who need. So how do we bridge this gap? How do we make sure the people who need the support, the people who can give the support, are working together, and in terms of localization and in terms of inclusivity? Sometimes that doesn't happen, because you find much as the donor wants to support us, their conditions and the way they frame things, and us being intimidated, are not able to work on the same page. And we then fear to maximize on that space. So this is a message to donors to see how to bridge that gap, and for us to see how to sit on the table, how to get ourselves seated on the table. I'll give an example. Like, we had a USAID project where we came up with a good idea, where the donors came up with a good idea. I think it's something that had been done also elsewhere, where we used to have like a biscuit and tea every Friday, and we could discuss about issues of the program. We could advise the program, and we could also see how to ensure that the HIV program is maximizing, the violence program is maximizing. But we noted that the women, when they're given the biscuits, they put them in the pocket, then they just drink the juice. Then they're like, how can I eat biscuits? I need to take it to my children. So as a local organization, we changed that. Yeah, they were like, the children need the biscuits more than they do. So they didn't see it as a tea, as a high tea something. So they changed, and the local people who are advising, the sex workers who are advising the program, said that maybe we call it a pilau Friday instead of a juice Friday. So the pilau, we bought a charcoal stove, and the groups could take turns to make the rice. And up to today, we have that as a best practice, and other organizations are implementing that. So the women come together, and cooking is such a thing that brings people together than being offered. And the cost of the biscuits and the juice is the same that we are using to do the rice, and it makes a big difference. So that is part of what I can see as localization, and the donor coming and agreeing, yeah, maybe this is a better way of doing things. Inclusivity in terms of even thematic areas. We have a program that does a sexual and reproductive health. And we have gone ahead and looked at women who are not included in the sexual and reproductive health. I'll give an example of the street women, of the women in the dump site, some who are sex workers, some who are sexual minorities also. But when it comes to the support that partners will give, they just want to go and give clothes, they just want to go and give biscuit, food, but they don't realize, or even accommodation, but they don't realize these are mature women who also in need of family planning, in need of condoms, because they look at them as, if they're in the street, then maybe the best they can do is to get them off the street or give them food. But these women are giving birth, they are having unsafe abortions, many are dying in the process, and they are sexually violated. So that is a way that we need to look at people differently, look at needs differently, and not assume anything. Yeah, so that is on that. And when it comes to inclusivity in geographical regions, our organization works in different geographical areas. Among the ASAL counties, where we're working with the Muslim community, in Nairobi, where we are working in high-end brothels, in low-end brothels, and with the sexual minority, the lesbians. So different kind of programming requiring different way of looking at things. And you can only see this when you have an eye of inclusivity and an eye of looking at the local things. Yeah, I will do that for the introduction.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the examples. I really loved Pilau Friday. And the reason why, yeah, the reason why I picked on that, and I did a lot of global work for many years, where we're looking at integrating women's rights and feminist politics and power analysis in all development work of an international organization I was with. And one of the, I would say, an excuse most people used was, oh, but we don't, yeah, we understand the agenda and it's important, but we don't know how to do it, right? And I don't know, people think the how is like massive frameworks flying from Mars. The how is based on talking to local people and what works for them. An IT event is not gonna work when you've got an empty stomach, but a Pilau Friday is contextualized, it works, it's what's needed, what's relevant. And I really appreciate your sharing this very concrete example of, you know, your community and some of your team members being an advisor to the program. So there are so many ways that we can ensure inclusivity. So that's a great segue into the next section of our conversation, where we now want to move from the awareness and the argument of the why into the how, right? How do we actually practically work on equitable development that's locally driven and that's inclusive? Some practical examples. And from what all of you have mentioned, one of the themes or issues or lenses, you know, like glasses that's coming out is the lens of intersectionality. Each and every one of your communities, you know, it's not like a silo. They're just affected by this set of issues, but they're affected by so many other intersecting issues, as well as things that exacerbate their discrimination and marginalization. So I just want us to look at intersectionality as an important consideration in equitable and inclusive development that is locally driven. And the question to each of you, starting with Andrew, is, from your experience, what should we be thinking about here? From design to implementation, to monitoring, to evaluation, to the learning piece, to re-strategizing, to the resourcing. So the full programming cycle of achieving this work. What should we be looking at? What are some practical things that you can guide and advise us all to consider and to take up? Over to you, Andrew.
You know, when we talk about intersectionality with LGBTIQ people, often you go from the concept of intersectionality to the concept of identities to the concept of a population that in some instances has to hide and avoid risk. And so the first question is, who are we talking about? Which, in terms of LGBTIQ people, we're usually talking about a subpopulation of whichever population you're dealing with. You know, it's a scientific fact that LGBTIQ people, or people whose sexuality and gender expression differ from the majority, whether they identify that way or not, exist in all societies. So the first thing is, LGBT people are there. How then do you identify them? How do you track them for purposes of design, evaluation? How do you find people to participate in leadership and design? And there's no global practice. And so people are left without guidance on how to do this. And it's also very contextual. There are indigenous identities that go back hundreds of years in certain parts of the world that don't exist in others. And so, you know, what you want to do is kind of access both your public health folks, because they've had to figure out categories to track and do research, and local LGBTIQ people themselves to figure out how to track folks. And, you know, usually it's something on an intake form, or it's something that's told to a particular care provider. And so the provider can come up with a way of identifying the sexuality and gender of the person that they're talking to. But then the response sometimes to, okay, we recognize this population, the response is sometimes to say, well, we want to treat people equally, which then becomes, well, we want to treat people as if everybody's the same. And inclusion means we don't exclude people. So not excluding someone is not the same as including somebody, because with LGBTIQ people, the key then is to recognize the differences between LGBTIQ people and others, and how those differences create development needs. Rather than say, okay, the response is to ignore the differences and treat everybody the same. So those are the first two steps, is identification of the population and coming up with interventions that are specific rather than interventions that just hide everything.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I really like how you were very clear and very practical. And when for the many years, over 2 decades of working in global development, when I was equipping, and I continue to equip people on how to move from analysis to design to implementation and go through the cycle again, I like the 2 things you mentioned, right, which are already takeaways for all of us, right? One is how do you identify, right? So if you just remind yourself that the first thing or one thing I really need to be clear about is identification. And thank you for the guidance that, like look into public health folks, they have more categories, but also still go back to ask the community that already exists and is visible out there. But from identification, know that the very sexuality and gender expression that the LGBTI community has is an expression of difference. So that difference creates different needs. So by extension, in your program design, now be very clear, work with them to articulate what are those different needs, and then program around those different needs, in addition to what is general, right? So we still want everybody to get everything, but we go a step further into, okay, what additional things or different things or contextualized things does this population need? So thank you so much for those practical tips and examples. And I would like to segue to Willice, and for you to also share with us from a programmatic perspective, what are some of the practical things that people can do to make sure that, we have youth inclusive development?
Indeed. I think the best way to address this is to give some highlights of a study we recently did on youth ecosystem building for regional development, which worked with nearly 197 youth-led organizations and networks, to be precise, in terms of how we can strengthen the ecosystem and quantify their contributions both to national, local, and international development. And we found, in terms of intersectionalities, young people face new multidimensional forms of vulnerabilities that are not necessarily traditional. So, for instance, if you are quantifying, the contribution of young people to local development, to what extent does that take into account the unique effects of environmental degradation or climate change effect on young people as migrants, as refugees, moving them to urban areas where, they, for most part, would end in, informal settlements. How is that social, economic, and political? So these multi-dimensional forms of vulnerabilities are really affecting young people the most. And if you talk of a region like Africa, where the average age of the continent is 19 years, you are talking about an entire generation's lives and livelihoods are in the line and at risks. So But we also found that, you know, a large number of young people are in the rural areas, not necessarily in urban areas or semi-urban areas. They live, and even youth organizations are over 52% are based in the rural areas, so serving rural communities. So to what extent are our interventions going beyond the easy to reach locations in cities and in urban communities to go further afield? But we also you know, see potentials particularly around collaborations, around fostering, you know, synergies, particularly between adult-led and youth-led, you know, movements and organizations, so that we can learn from the innovations and novelties that, you know, young people bring to the board, as well as the experience that we learn from the more, you know, older organizations, and in terms of the bridging the generational divide. In terms of concretely, you know, what could be done, I mean, we are mostly organizations and members of the civil society in various respects, working at the intersection of different aspects of development. It would be crucial to incorporate youth-led approaches towards monitoring and evaluation of development projects and outcomes, because how, you know, youth are affected might be different from how, you know, they affect other generations, and approaches through which they would want, you know, to show up would be vastly different from what, you know, the framing that is more structured in, you know, for Africa, nearly post-independence framing of development and the inclusion of young people, to take into account emerging technologies that really determines how young people see, you know, their own role in shaping development locally. But also recognize youth development as a long-term endeavor. We see yet another ism, that is short-termism, where, you know, which may not, you know, youth is a more transitionary phase. So, you know, you are not a youth forever. So if you have a long-term, a short-term program that does not look and take into account a holistic view that this person will in a few years or in some time not be youth, and still work with them the journey to incorporate you know, a wholesome development framework. Investments in capacity building, you know, young people and youth organizations come as new entrants into the field. You know, in this panel, you might find, you know, people with 10 years of experience, 20 years of experience, but for young people, they may not have that kind of experience, yet their contribution is still extremely necessary to make our world a better place. Therefore, it is extremely important to invest in skilling and resourcing young people with the right tools that they need to succeed. I think this role of research, we see a lot of gaps in data. You know, is developing the Africa Youth Development Index, and what we've seen is how fragmented data is, and sometimes the data is even not available. So, you know, and the knowledge gap, where, you know, issues that affect you know, young people are researched in the North, right? So and that forms the basis of evidence that is used to shape. So you know, it is around the intellectual influence and also the knowledge generation that is local and appreciated, that this still meets the rigors and standards to be used internationally, rather than a more what we see of a more top-down approaches to knowledge generation that affects young people locally here in Nairobi or Zambia or wherever. So it is, I think, as we talk about localization, to take into account the issues that go beyond the narrative, and to concretely have the localization agenda deeply rooted in local communities, appreciating that indigenous knowledge, for example, local knowledge, is extremely important in shaping how local actors look at their own position in development.
All right. Thank you so much, Willice. And I will start with where you ended, which is sort of like local knowledge generation, and respect and valuing that local knowledge. And I would like to encourage all our panelists, if you've got any sort of like links or resources or your own details to share, feel free to use the chat. And the thing I'm picking up from what you shared, which we can add to sort of like a running checklist of consideration, is really think about the data and the research. So the data and the research of any of the vulnerable communities you are working with is really, really crucial and critical, because as we heard earlier in the framing, where we're talking about, have a conversation with people, and inclusion is actually asking the question, inviting to the space and table, and hearing their voice. And I picked on new vulnerabilities. So for some of us who've been in the development sector for a while, we can sort of end up assuming things and recycling issues, but there are indeed new vulnerabilities, some that you point out to do with climate or induced by climate change, but also some that are induced by technology, right? We are hailing technology, we are using technology, we are struggling with technology, and there are new vulnerabilities that are coming with technology. So part of what we continuously need to be looking at with these marginalized populations is really what could be new vulnerabilities that we are not even aware of, and ask. And the last one, among many others, is really location, right? Considering location, specific design, not just easy access, particularly where young people are concerned, because most people say they are working with young people, but it's mostly those in the urban areas who are sort of like tech warriors and on X and all other digital media platforms that are easy to use. So really, let's probably be thinking about the last mile, to the most remote areas as well. Thank you so much. And I would like to turn it over to Scader and Susan to also chime in with some practical things to consider as we work with disabled people. Over to you.
Yeah, so I think for disabled people, it is also important when we talk about intersectionalities to understand, for instance, for disabled women, the double discrimination that they face, and the extra work that they have to put in to just make it or to just attain their desired goals, but also to understand that disability is an evolving concept, realizing that the people who were disabled 20, 30 years ago, you find that now there have been other people who are getting disabled by accidents, by diseases, by maternal complications, and different things, accidents, things that are impacting us. And the more reason these conversations are of urgency, because we must begin to incorporate the specific needs and the emerging needs of the disabilities that are coming up because of what is happening in our environment, including the wars and also the disasters. So coming to the practical side, I wanted to start by saying it is important in localization to break the barriers. So for disabled people, there are a lot of barriers that we encounter. And I'm happy that Humantum has already done some work around identifying the barriers to localization. I'm just hoping in your report, there are some specific barriers that you have identified for disabled people, some things that are hindering localization of this particular grouping of people. So the most important barriers that we need to make sure that we are breaking mostly attitudinal. So for us to participate in the development, including decision-making processes, oftentimes we encounter barriers of attitudes, people thinking that we don't have the potential, we cannot achieve, we cannot contribute effectively, we don't have anything really to bring to the table. So those are the things that we need to break. So recognizing that we have the potential, like I'm talking here, I'm joining this call as a consultant. And oftentimes you find that if a disabled person is participating in different spaces or different conversation, it will be in a disempowering position. Or if it's in a community in the development process, they will be like a beneficiary, not necessarily an active participant, someone that would be intentional in bringing to the table to share their views. So let's break down those barriers that we have identified to make sure that we are really intentional about localization. Secondly is also compositing the skills, the expertise that disabled people have. So I often times say that the organizations or companies or the development community is losing quite a lot in an untapped resource in the diversity of disabled people, because within the disability community, we are also a quite diverse community, but there are a lot of untapped competences, untapped expertise that people don't realize because of the, again, attitudinal barriers that I have mentioned. So where we have identified that resource, which is available, where we have identified it, and we have put in place reasonable accommodations to allow those people to exercise and contribute to their full potential, we must also be prepared to compensate fairly for their skills and expertise. The other thing that I wanted to also add is that development partners have for a long time, because of the stringent requirements of their funding mechanisms, funding means, been working with organizations that are in quotes, working like the same that Willice said, on behalfism. So there are those organizations that are working on behalf of disabled people. But we have organizations of disabled people. And for us, disabled people, there's a way we define what a disabled people's organization is. So we look at leadership, so the composition of leadership. And from leadership, we are looking at the governance structure. Who is sitting in the board? Who is making decisions? And who is sitting at the, for example, secretariat? Who is running the day-to-day things of the organization? Who is making decisions? Who is sitting in spaces where they are influencing policy changes and all that? So for us, if less than 51% of the leadership of that particular organization is not disabled people themselves, then that organization is not a disabled people's organization. So it's important for the development community to also understand what it means to work with disabled people's organizations, because these people are the experts at a local level that they can help with the practical ways of being inclusive when it comes to disability. Unlike organizations that are working on behalf of disabled people who have the theoretical expertise, but when it comes to the practical side, they have zero experience in terms of what they are dealing with. I have a lot of examples from where I live in my community, the work that we have done with Mayusa. I have done with Mayusa as a consultant, locally supporting disabled people's organizations, to be more inclusive, to be intentional about inclusive, and also mobilizing other friends or other peers with disabilities to influence policy changes. And we have seen that where we are allowed to sit at the table, and sometimes we are not even allowed, we have to break and we have to infiltrate. So I've done that where I have actually seen an advert in the newspaper for a particular organization looking for board members. And I have said, I have to sit on that board because I'm interested in supporting that board or supporting that organization to be inclusive in their health system. So it's a decision that I make, and I get to that interview and I force them to make reasonable accommodations for me to participate in interviews. And then I sit at the table and I'm able to contribute and tell them how they can practically do that. But that happens in both ways. Organizations or development partners realizing the potential that we have, the untapped resource that we are, the expertise that we have, and realizing that through our experiences, really, if we are brought to the table to share those experiences, to use those practical experiences in development, we could influence quite a lot. And the Sustainable Development Goals have been quite intentional about it. It's just, I think, the policies and all the funding restrictions that are there that haven't, because the Sustainable Development Goals have embedded the leaving no one behind campaign. And then you find that when it comes to the actual implementation of the SDGs, then you find that people are not being inclusive. So if we are practical in breaking the barriers, and I know in this call we are not talking about the detailed barriers, but I've just given an example. If we are intentional about realizing the potential that disabled people have, the power that they have, the untapped expertise that they have, that they are experts in their own right, and they are not just beneficiaries, they are not victims, they are not patients, but they are active participants in the development process. We compensate for their expertise. We empower them. We use an empowering approach. We don't disempower them, but by looking at them like beggars and all that, then we, most importantly, work with disabled people's organizations. And I have taken time to define which organizations are these. And then we also look at the restrictions that are there, because oftentimes when development partners are coming local to work with local organizations, they bring stringent requirements. So we must also look at those requirements and make sure that they are not acting as a barrier already in making sure that organizations of disabled people's organizations are also able to participate in that. Susan,
yeah, wow, Scader, you took the words right out of my mouth. I loved everything that you said, and so much the importance of working with disabled people's organizations, not, as Willice says, not behalfism, not people who say they're working on behalf of disabled people, but disabled people themselves. You said everything. I just wanted to add one of the terms that I use a lot that resonates with me is I say that inclusion has taken too long. I mean, we've been working on inclusion, for like 40, 50, 60, 100 years. So a lot of times we're saying we're moving from inclusion to infiltration. And what that means is we need, as disabled people, and as part of intersectionality, to infiltrate. Like, disabled people need to be part of all your youth movements and every single youth club and the LGBT and the women. So we need to infiltrate and collaborate with all the other movements, because disabled people have so many identities. So I can't think of any group that people with disabilities would not be part of. And then I think that we have to also talk about reverse infiltration, that if you are, as an organization or a movement, don't have people with disabilities, you need to go and infiltrate where we are and find us. And I know we've put resources in the chat, like Eddie, our excellence in development, disability inclusion, that disabled people are in every country. We have alumni in over 135 countries. We have disabled women in over 89 countries have gone on leadership programs. Disabled people are out there, so we need to infiltrate your movement, but you need to infiltrate our movements. And then just as Andrew said, you can't treat everybody the same. That important thing about reasonable accommodation, you have to have the money in your budget for sign language interpreters, for accessible transportation, for whatever people need. So inclusion isn't treating everyone as the same, but in putting in that reasonable accommodation number. And then this lastly, Scader, it seems that everyone, as you said, talks about disability as a deficit. We need to switch that definition and say disability as a plus. We're all celebrating, a lot of us, disability pride, being proud of who we are, disabled women, loud, proud, passionate. So with that, I can feel the energy in the room. I'm feeling it. So I just want to pass it back to you, Emma, and thank you, Scader, for articulating it so beautifully.
I can feel the passion and the energy, and lots of very, very practical things to consider. Some of them that are already relevant to the next section that we're going to be talking about, where we are saying, for locally led development that's inclusive and equitable to happen, we need strategically to unlock the power of operations. And you already, signposting to, an organization's architecture, where you said, let's have the leadership, let's have the decision-making structure, senior leaders, and whoever is in that organization. For it to be a disabled people's organization, it has to be at least 51+%. And Scader, thank you so much for already signposting, and saying, the sustainable development goals already have an aspiration. It's donor flexibility and funding requirements that needs to catch up. The one that I'm gonna take to our next panelist is sort of like a segue, is really attitudinal barriers, right? How people perceive people who are different from them, and how that really, really is damaging to all the efforts all of you are making, and why that's so important to work on and address. So Peninah, close this section for us in terms of the programming piece, what we need to consider quite practically. Over to you, Peninah.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for everything everybody's saying is also very relevant to me. So I will not repeat about inclusivity in terms of the percentages of sex workers, the percentages of LGBT people who need to be. I will not repeat all that. It is very, very relevant. You're preaching to the choir, actually. So when it comes to design, I'll just say the design needs to be simple. We know where we want to go. We're moving from here to there. So when you put very complicated tools, and it makes programming look like something very foreign, and we give up as organization, as community organization. We tend to be very intimidated. So things need to be simple when it comes to inclusivity and intersectionality, so that we can all participate fairly. We need to sit on the table. I'll put that again. I had already said, we need to sit on the table. So who will help us be in this table? Our partners, the community, the government needs to help us sit on the table, so that we are not being discussed in absentia. I don't know what they say about the meal or you're eating. I don't know, but we need to sit on the table. In this way, we will be more inclusive. Intersectionality will also happen. Intersectionality also recognizes that our group, as sex workers, as minority women, face a lot of multiple layers of discrimination that needs to be addressed. That's what we mean by intersectionality. Layers of discrimination in terms of economic, violence, and all that really affects. Then, of course, there's power imbalance, and that's why I said about sitting on the table. We need to be included in terms of goals at national level, the goals of the country when it comes to things like fighting poverty, things like climate change. People feel that only certain groups should participate. I remember a time when our organization was selected among the organizations that were going to talk about peace building during elections, and sometimes also about teaching people about the Constitution, and we were empowered to do that. But organizations came and said that organizations that are doing HIV work should not be doing that kind of a work. So you're boxed in certain certain corners, yet you're a citizen, you're a Kenyan citizen, you're a Ugandan citizen, you're a global citizen, and all the issues that affect the women movement also affect us as minority women. And we should, inclusion and intersectionality should be recognized of that. Talking about the women movement, that is a very hot potato for us. There is a lot of, we're torn in the middle, a lot of challenges in working with the feminist movement, a lot of misunderstanding about the rights of sex workers, and feminists movement feeling that certain people are, how do I say this, are violated, have no power, are trafficked, and not respecting our own agency. I think conversation needs to happen about respecting sex workers who say that they have chosen that, maybe among the limited choices, but still that is what has been selected, because this is a issue that makes us not to be included in various places. It is only, I think, a year or 2 years ago that our representative from the sex work community participated in the CSW. In the CSW, because initially that conversation was very uncomfortable for the women movement, and so sex workers, although they're women, were not included in those kind of convenings. So yeah, so those are some challenges that we face.
All right, Peninah, you just stopped right there with the hot potato. And I think what I'm taking away, and what I also know from my experience, is any community, any movement, any collective group network should not be idolized or idealized. We should also recognize that any formation is a structure of power and a potential space of discrimination, othering, and exclusion. So that in your submission is, as much as any movement of people who are a discriminated group or community exists, we should also recognize that within those groups and collectives, we should also be addressing the question of power imbalance, the question of agency, the question of recognizing and appreciation, choice, and being inclusive within the movement itself, right? And that way we become stronger, and we are not fragmenting ourselves before we are fragmented by the external world, so to speak. So thank you so much about that. Please continue to post questions in the chat. We've got 2 that we are going to answer in the next section. So I'm really going to ask each of our panelists to, as we move into an operation, as we move into the section where we are looking at, what we believe at Umentum, that, for us to achieve this aspiration that we've been talking about and unlock the strategic power of operations, we have 4 areas or 4 levers or strategic areas of change in any organization's operating model. So some of you have been signposting this already. So we want to talk about institutional architecture, which is the system and structure of the work. How do we actually organize ourselves to deliver the work and be able to do this work? And you're starting to speak to it, Peninah, talking about, you know, the form of organizing as a structure and vehicle for change. And I know Scader was talking about, you know, disabled people's organizations and how they're organized. And so Willice, prepared to share with us, you know, from your perspective, when we talk about institutional architecture, you know, of, let's say, a youth-led or youth-focused organization, what should you people be considering, particularly the mainstream organizations that want to integrate that youth-led focus in the institutional architecture? Then people and culture, we are looking at who does the work. And how do we work together? How do we do the work? The culture. How do we hire people, strengthen capacity? And if we could have, I would say, Susan and Scader prepare to talk about that. You were already signposting, I think, Scader, where you were saying, or was it, Scader was talking about, you know, we need to have voice sitting at the table, have the capacity, and we have the capacity. So we are an untapped resource. So what could we be thinking about? What could we also, particularly mainstream organizations, be considering when it comes to people and culture and inclusivity? Then I would like Andrew and Peninah to talk about, you know, recent risk and accountability, where we are talking about, you know, accountability for the work that is being done. What are some of the things that we need to be talking about? And I do recall Andrew already saying, you know, where you are not filling the knowledge gap, right, with the LGBTI community groups themselves or any other discriminated community, you are already sort of like having your risk radar, you know, up in the air. And we will close off by just an quick open discussion around funding and financial systems, how the work is actually funded. And all of you have been signposting that, you know, the funding has to be adaptable, agile, unrestricted, and allow you to do all sorts of wonderful things. So in that order, if we could start hearing from Willice, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, so that we finish on time. Just something very specific around institutional architecture. Then Scader and Susan on people and culture, and then risk and accountability. We'll start with Andrew and finish off with Peninah. So over to you, Willice.
Yes, indeed. So, you know, first and foremost, as the executive director at the Youth Cafe, I see my role as that of a catalyst and a facilitator, a supporter of youth-led processes, rather than imposing my own ideas. We work to provide guidance, ensuring that the vision and the mission and the goals of the organization align with the interests of young people that we serve directly. And we do this through regular consultations. We have monthly, you know, youth public opinion, where because, you know, issues that affect youth also change, and this we reflect in our own plans as they evolve. When I was interviewing for the role, I was asked my opinion on or what is horizontal leadership, and I would characterize institutional frameworks, particularly for youth-led organizations, to be more horizontal than vertical. And I've certainly seen and been a beneficiary of that system that is more dynamic and horizontal. As we see, it provides a basis for the birth of a lot of innovative ideas suggested by young people, without being stuck into hierarchical or vertical systems. So we, of course, incorporate those elements as well.
Oh, sorry. I was saying, is it just me or Willice froze while talking about horizontal leadership?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Maybe whilst we wait for him to come back, Susan, take the mic and let's talk about people and culture. What should we be considering in terms of inclusivity?
Okay, good. Thank you for that. Well, I think Scader made so many important points already about the importance of including DPOs and co-creating programs. I want to just talk about, if you really, for me, and I think others would agree, if you really want to be serious about disability inclusion, and I think we've already made the fact that disabled people need to be a part of everyone's program, whether it's youth, LGBT, climate change, whatever. You've got to put these things in your budget. You've got to put in your admin budget 1 to 3% for reasonable accommodation. And that means that if you hire a person with disability, they may or may not need it, but maybe they need some software, maybe they need an interpreter, maybe they need some other accommodation, but you have that in the budget so you don't have to think, how am I going to pay for that? To Andrew's point, you can't treat everyone the same. You got to treat what people need to completely participate. And in your program budget, we suggest that you put 3 to 5% of every program budget for reasonable accommodation. Again, when you're doing your program, whether it's a transportation course, a personal assistant cost. But if you don't have those line items in your budget, then at least for me, it's hard to think that people are really serious about including people with disabilities. And some foundations we work with, MacArthur Foundation through Lever for Change, every single grant that they give out, nothing to do with disability, had to show in their budget these real accommodation. And it made people think, oh, I haven't thought about disability. Okay, now I need to think about it. And then, yes, you have disabled people on your staff, on your board, on your programs, and as Scader says, as leaders, as consultants. So I really want to leave people with that, because I think it's very practical. And for me, whatever program you're doing, if you look at the people in your program and you don't see people with disabilities, there's something missing. And then you need to be intentional and go out and, as we say, find those partners, put the partners in the budget. And to the question I know that came, when we write a grant, we have money for consultants, for disabled consultants, for reasonable accommodation. So I think as part of the architecture and seeing disability as a positive, not a deficit, these are some very practical things that you do. And I know we've also put in the chat, to give an example of a program we did with giving disabled women in 6 countries the money to end violence against women during COVID, and to see what they did with that money, them being the leaders of that project. So we'll put that video in the chat. Disabled women leaders leading the way. That's how it should be. Scader?
Thank you, Susan, for emphasizing that, especially on the budget and how Mayusa is empowering us as disabled women. But coming back to people and culture, I think people and culture anchors by the name the culture of the organization. So they are the ones that are the gatekeepers in terms of who is coming in the organization, who is leaving. So if an organization doesn't employ intentionally disabled people, we should start questioning how our people and culture processes are looking like, and including our policies. So it is the whole process. It's not an event. It's not something that you do in bits. At the recruitment stage is when I can be inclusive, and not in advertising. Maybe it starts at advertising. How are the adverts reaching out to disabled people with their diverse needs? And how is the recruitment process? And even before the recruitment process, but even the adverts, it's not enough to just say we encourage disabled people to apply.
People to apply.
You have to go further and say we provide the needed reasonable accommodations for people with disability, to be able to participate, say, in interviews and all that. So it's the whole process. So when it comes to recruitment, how are you making sure that the recruitment process is inclusive? Performance management, how are you providing, how are you making sure that you are providing individualized support? Because when it comes to disability, it's not just having a policy. You say we have a disability policy or an inclusion policy, but it's looking at the specific needs of individuals who are disabled within the organization, and how are you tailoring support that is helping them to realize their full potential within the organization, whilst also taking care of their specific needs. So I know Susan has already, so my emphasis was that when it comes to people and culture, we have to look at the whole process and not implement things in bits, but make sure that we are incorporating all the needed requirements.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Peninah, can you chime in on risk and accountability? How can organizations doing this type of work that you're doing, balance the need to be accountable in a traditional way, yet sometimes it may be at the risk of people's lives or anything that may put them at risk, or the conditions of accountability and the type of risk approach or risk appetite is not as it should be. Anything you want to say around risk? And Andrew, be ready to also speak after Peninah.
When it comes to risk and accountability, this is a very crucial time, especially in Africa, and I think around the globe more now than ever, because we are in a season where we are seeing that people are losing their lives just because of advocating, just because of identifying, just because of supporting people that other people get upset about. And it's very important that at this moment in time, we be cognizant and supportive of each other, so that we are taking risks that are worth, so that we are accounting to our people. And we have seen partners also recognizing this and seeing even our partners coming to just ask us, what's going on? How can we support you? But we need to see more of this. I can give an example, like for USAID, I know there is more commitment in terms of resources and support to local organizations in the sex work and LGBT communities, just recognizing the kind of risk and the kind of work that we are doing. We really welcome such interventions and ask that other partners come on board and do something little, just because they're seeing how things really are with us. I saw somebody asking about collective advocacy. I'll just answer even as I answer that. Collective advocacy, how are we working as a community with the disability movement, with the LGBT movement, with the women movement, with the climate change movement? How are we working so that we don't reinvent the wheel every time? And so that we are making use of resources, and so that we're piggybacking on each other and using the same avenue. That is happening a lot in recognition of one goal, one movement, and scarce resources. So, but these conversations need to happen even more. I like that question. These conversations need to happen even more. We can't be doing our things in silos, because the impact becomes very little. And at this time of the accountability, we need to really work together.
Thank you, Peninah. And if the questions are also in the chat, and if any of the panelists have got examples in terms of links, videos from their websites that help to respond in more detail to these questions, please feel free to post. Over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, well, when the issue of risk comes up with LGBTIQ programming, often comes up at the global level, where there is an assumption that this is a, quote, criminalized population. Therefore, it's hard to have inclusion. And usually that's a reference to the existence of sodomy laws in between 65 and 70 countries. But those laws criminalize a particular sexual act. They don't criminalize, with the exception of just really less than a handful, They don't criminalize identities. They don't criminalize providing services or doing advocacy. So those laws are not only not really determinative of the ability to do programming, but in fact, many people think that where there's a criminal law, there's not going to be any LGBTIQ civil society. There is no correlation at all between the existence of a criminal law and the existence of an LGBTIQ civil society. There are groups in countries with criminal laws that are thriving and doing all kinds of things. And the second barrier is the fear of socio and cultural discrimination and stigma. So this is the fear that, well, if we do something, we're going to face backlash. And that is often based on, again, a lack of knowledge. And so the very best people, I mean, think about it. Here we have a population that every single day of their lives has to assess risk around them, has to figure out ways to avoid and mitigate that risk. Many of these groups have had formal security training. They are the experts at assessing risk of backlash and security threats and suggesting measures. And so what we have almost inevitably when I work with groups, particularly in the women's and health communities at the global level, they say, oh, no one in our network is doing this work. And so I say, could you just send out a survey and ask providers supporting locally, are LGBT people in your population? Do you know who the leadership of the community is? And particularly in those groups, I always find that on the ground, people are saying, sure, of course we work with this community. They're there, they need help. They have the same overlapping needs as other folks. But frankly, and then this is, the communication up to the global level is, this is not work is not funded. So no one asks about it. It's on no form. We don't get anything by telling the global headquarters about it. So it's often happening at a much richer pace at the local level than the global headquarters realize. And so that's, again, localization is part of inclusivity.
Thank you so much. Willice, are you back with us? Because I know you froze and probably dropped off before you finished. Just 2 minutes, please.
Yes, I'm back, and thank you for that. As I was saying, in terms of the leadership and institutional structure, the Youth Cafe has really benefited immensely in scaling its activities and operations through the power of youth networks. So we are home to over 4,000 other youth organizations, and they are sector agnostic, so they work on various issues that interface with our own work. In that way, we are able to achieve scale, to be more agile and nimble, as well as be able to operate in contexts and jurisdictions which we would not typically operate in due to cultural, even linguistic issues. And this has been demonstrated, when we created, for instance, a youth manifesto. We worked with over 240, other youth organizations, and there were the young women rights organizations. There are minority, indigenous youth organizations. So that way, we're able to tap into, that power of building a movement. We have over time adapted our processes to be more dynamic, to respond to the expectations of young people, and also new and emerging issues such as most youth networks and organizations. Some of them are not registered. They operate informally, and that does not mean that they are not doing meaningful work on the ground. So how do we tap into the power of networks and localize this for scaling local development? But this has to be has to be resourced and structured. As we are talking about localization, and I know we'll be about funding in a short while. But most of the youth organizations 63% of youth organizations self-finance their own work. So the work funded by the founders of those organizations. So how do we make localization sustainable and also link trickle down of resources to support organizations at a grassroots level? As we speak today, out of the over $7 billion of US dollars of humanitarian aid that went last year to sub-Saharan Africa, only 5.2 went to local organizations. So how do you reconcile that with the narrative and movement around localization? So I think, as it were, we need to follow it with also funds and clear funding systems that are part of the institutional development.
All right. Okay. Right there in our last piece, which is around funding and financial systems, and your question, your call to action, particularly for funders and any intermediary, whether international organizations or bigger national CSOs, is, put your money where your mouth is, right? So don't just continue as business as usual in terms of funding allocation and in terms of flexibility. And in terms of funding as well, we heard from, I think it was Scader, who was saying, loosen stringent requirements as a way of loosening the barriers and provide sort of like flexible funding. And I also heard from Peninah, I think right at the beginning, where she was saying the same amount of funding for certain things that are designed somewhere else, could be done in a contextualized way that is actually much more sustainable. And we also heard from Andrew saying, you may have resources for general programming, but also have resources specifically for those different needs, particularly of the LGBTI community. So quite a lot has been said about funding, and we are almost at the top of our hour. There's a question for Susan and Scader, or Scader in the chat, which has to do with, have you been able to find funding opportunities that provide compensation for local experts and include accessibility funding? So if you could type in the chat and maybe share some information there, because I want to give each of the panelists, so that we are right on time, an opportunity to say a final message, very succinct, very clear, a call to action to any of the development actors that we know are in the space in terms of something practical around what we've been talking about today. Inclusivity by design. We want equitable development that's locally driven and inclusive. And I will start in terms of that final message with you, Peninah. You've always been the last in the last couple of rounds. What will be your closing message? Let's start with you.
My call for action is support women in all the communities, in all their diversity, and the figures Willice was saying, that this percentage goes to locally, very small percentage, like 5% goes to local organizations. Let us change that conversations. Let us have more accountability. I have seen USA putting an ambitious figure of 25% that they intend to do in the year 2025. Can we have other partners come out and say, so right now we are just giving 2% to local organization, but we're going to build to 5% in this, and this is how we're going to do it. Let's work together. And the impact of funding local organization has been proven that with very little resources, communities are able to do so much when they are the ones they're the ones designing their programs. So
Yes.
I would just call for that more support and for the integration and the intersectionalities of communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Peninah. Willice, over to you. Succinct, clear call to action. What are you asking for?
Absolutely. I think for us, our based on the evidence and the studies that we've been doing around funding for youth-led organizations is to particularly those who hold the purse strings, to ensure that funds are not simply absorbed by the same actors as before. Realizing that these means, of course, shifting not only power but also shifting resources, particularly.
Okay, Willice is frozen again. Over to you, Andrew. What would be your closing ask and call to action?
Well, I would say talk to a local LGBTIQ person.
In terms of climate change work, youth organizations did 80% of climate change related initiatives, but only received 1.2% of any climate change funding. That is just an example in one sector. This can be
okay, so shift resources.
Yes. Shift resources and also adopt more, key practical measures such as, allocate. Can we ensure that we allocate 20% of your budget to local youth-led organizations?
All right, that's a big ask, but yeah, we'll take it. Over to you, Andrew.
Well, aside from talking to local folks, I think the research shows that when organizations thoroughly respond to the needs of one marginalized populations, usually that results in program designs that help other people as well. So I would say that it's, we find that schools that are accessible to children with disabilities are better for all students, including gay students. Schools that are tolerant and respond to bullying are also better for all students. So the single identity is not just a single identity, it's a good start that would help everybody.
Absolutely love that. It's not only about one identity, but it's for the collective. Okay, thank you. Susan and Scader, closing ask message, very succinct and to the point as we are at time.
Okay, I'll go first. Let Scader have the last word. I would just say join us is my message. So join us by contact us about being part of EDDI, where we can help you connect with the amazing DPOs all over the world, Disabled Women's Action or Disabled Women's Organizations, and give you the how-tos and partner with disability groups. And I love that ask. Make a big part of your budget, not only reasonable accommodation, but making sure that you have money to partner with disability groups and hire them as consultants and experts in Scader. And I am just, I have to say, so energized by this panel, and I'm excited just in our own thing to work with the people on this panel, because I've learned so much from you and want to work with each and every one of you. So thank you. And Scader?
Scader, last word.
I think Susan has said it all, but just to add that our development partners have a huge opportunity to accelerate localization in terms of including some specific provisions on how disabled people can be included in an empowering way. And also the due diligence tools that they are using for international organizations cannot work for local ones. So we need local for the local organizations, at the same time realizing the risks that are there, but empowering and building their capacity so that they can match their capacities to the other organizations. Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel. Thank you so much.
Oh my God, it was absolutely wonderful, a mid-rush, but so rich. And I was summarizing every section and highlighting key points, so I will not go over that again. But just 2 points that you can find, and Jenna is our advocacy manager, brilliant at bringing us all together for this webinar. Thank you, Jenna. She's gonna put in the chat where you can find other locally led development events and recordings as well as most of the publications we've had. Thank you so much, everybody. Again, my name is Enich Pembere. I'm the Director for Locally Led Development at Momentum, and it was so wonderful having you here today. Bye for now.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you,
thank
Annie.
you.
Thank you.